Welcome to the day 2 of AgriFin's annual learning event 2021. It's a pleasure to for you to join us today for the data sharing session. My name is Victoria Claus. I'm a senior technology and agriculture expert with the AgriFin program. I'm based here in Nairobi, Kenya. I've been with the team for about a year and a half, and my background is in, I've worked for around 10 years in the digital innovation and agriculture sector in emerging markets. So it's my pleasure to be moderating our session today. We've got some great content to share with you, and we have a great lineup of speakers. So I would like to start by just giving a quick background to AgriFin and what we do at the AgriFin program, in case some of you are new to what we do. I would encourage you to watch the 3-minute video, which is on the homepage, the lobby page, which gives a great background to AgriFin as a whole. Essentially what we do at AgriFin, we partner with over 130 different organizations that are working on the ground in Africa. We design, test and scale digitally enabled products for smallholder farmers. Over the last 6 years, we have reached 5.6 million smallholder farmers, and we are about to embark on a new 4-year journey with the AgriFin program. And we're really excited to be doing that with all our partners. Great, I will ask somebody to, first I'll just run through the agenda very quickly before we open the panel. So in today's session, we will start with a presentation from Matt Shakovskoy, who is joining us from ISF Advisors. Matt will be giving us the key insights and the highlights from a learning brief that we published with ISF Advisors last year. And that's really looking at trends, barriers, challenges that organizations are finding and experiencing when it comes to data sharing in the agriculture sector. We also have some tools that we'd like to share with the audience as part of that learning brief. And one of those tools I will provide a snapshot of today. That's the data readiness tool. We will then move to a panel discussion. We have 4 excellent speakers with us today who will introduce themselves as we begin that section of the event. And what I wanted to note was we want this session to be as interactive as possible. So please, as the audience, post your comments, your thoughts, any questions you have for Matt or the panelists, please post them in the chat box during the session, and we will copy and somebody will direct those questions to us. So we've allocated some time at the end for those questions, so please do get involved. Great. Well, thanks again to everybody for joining, and I would like to now hand over to Matt from ISF, who will lead us through the presentation. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Victoria. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here and to have the opportunity to share some of the work that we did with the AgriFin team last year. So I'll just share my screen now and give you a little bit of a sense of what we really covered in this learning brief. As we sat down with the AgriFin team to think about what this sort of learning process could cover when it came to data, the context was that there was so many new digital technologies and innovative business models that had been emerging across the continent and even in Southeast Asia and in other parts of the world that were just generating so much data. And there was so many potential use cases of that data. But AgriFin had been so much in the churn of delivering a number of those engagements, working on a number of those products. So this learning brief really sought to take stock of what had been learned within that portfolio of engagements and to take a systemic look at some of those barriers that were constraining a number of the service providers from using that data to create products for the wider ecosystem and for smallholder farmers. So the case study itself is on the AgriFin website. It runs about 30 or 40 slides long, and it really covers 4 key areas in, I guess, the the bulk of the case study. So we looked at the promise and role of data sharing in agriculture, took stock of some of the key trends that were underpinning that whole movement. We did a lot of analysis to look really strategically at the barriers and challenges to effective data sharing, coming up with a number of taxonomies of those current barriers and sub-barriers, and looked at what needed to happen, I guess, in order to empower effective data sharing between organizations. One of the things that emerged through the work was the identification of a number of tools that we thought would be really useful for the rest of the sector to start to use. So through the work, we actually generated 3 practical tools, which we'll give you a little bit of insight into today. The first was a framework for understanding what data is and how it could be used. So this sort of taxonomy and this language that we can all start to align around in terms of understanding data, we thought was really useful. We developed an organizational readiness tool, which is a practical survey that we'll take you through today. And we developed, I guess, a blueprint of a process for establishing data sharing agreements between organizations. So those 3 tools are all available in the case study, and we're keen to get them out there and being used. So as we started within AgriFin's portfolio, we started to understand that out of, say, 130 odd partnerships that they'd been working on over the previous 5 years, about 25% of them were working with some sort of data sharing agreement. Some of those were really basic in terms of just being able to share data sets between organizations in Excel spreadsheets, and some of them were a bit more advanced, working with open API portals and that sort of stuff. But some of the other key, I guess, metrics that came out of that were around 70% involved tech companies. We looked across use cases, and they included credit scoring and training and open access to information. But I think one of the biggest framing insights from looking at this portfolio of really interesting partnerships was that many of the partners that we were looking at had really high hopes and ambitions around the use of data and data partnerships, but we're really only at the beginning of understanding how to work with that data. What we started to understand is really low levels of data sharing readiness. So through the remainder of this quick presentation, I just want to hit some of the highlights of the work. One of the important sort of framing elements to the work was understanding that there was 3 really different types of service delivery models that were using data sharing agreements. So in a large number of cases, it was really just what we called multilateral service provider partnerships. So this was 2 or more partners who independently decided to share data in order to support a shared product. That's really different from some of the platform models like DigiFarm and others who were looking to set up an infrastructure and have data sharing agreements between multiple participants on that platform to allow them to provide products and services on that platform, which in itself was, again, really distinct from these open data initiatives, which were looking at more publicly accessible, aggregated data sets that were being made available to a number of different actors and on public platforms. So important to understand, I guess, the framework or the business model that was underlying the use of data and a data sharing agreement in the first instance. As we started to dig into these use cases, it became really, and I guess dig into the context more of what was going on around data in ag. There's this unbelievable increase in the amount of data that's being generated through ag tech. And that's making some of these big data trends more relevant. Lots of the big private companies that are operating in the agricultural sector are increasingly looking to use that data to learn more about their farmers, but also to create, I guess, more insight about how to serve them. But in the development space, organizational focus was really on these open data platforms to decrease the cost of business. So lots of momentum around data, lots of momentum around data enabling service provision, but really, I think where we're at is really understanding and unpacking how that can work. So here I just want to give you a sense of maybe 8 of the big takeaways from the study. The first is, as I've mentioned, that most institutions are at an early stage of understanding and working with data, and support's often needed to spark interest in what can be done. So this extends all the way back to even what sort of data do you have in your organization? How does that need to be codified and collected and put in common databases? And then what can that be used for? How can that be linked to products, services, insights, decision-making, all that sort of stuff? At that point, another big finding was that even for those organizations that had fairly good awareness of the data that they had and how it could be useful, making that next step to having a solid business case for investment is quite a significant leap, particularly in the absence of information and benchmarks needed to make that initial case. So what's the ROI in dealing with data? Because data is quite expensive, from collecting to storing to analyzing. There's a cost involved in using data. How do you make the case to senior management that investing in that is going to be a good investment? We found that these data sharing arrangements between organizations are probably unsurprisingly quite costly to establish and complex to navigate. And they require capabilities that few institutions have in-house. So it involves a level of sophistication on both sides of that arrangement. It requires that both parties can understand the shared benefit that they can have in sharing that data. And there's lots of complexity in just the logistics around sharing data and making that link to a use case. We also found, number 4 here, that to maximize the benefits of data partnerships, organizations need to have the right enablers in place. And that really led us down this track of creating this data readiness assessment tool that can help reveal those enablers. Unsurprisingly, regulatory compliance and consumer protection is a massive part of data usage, and that requires an even different capability, which is around legal understanding of many of the restrictions and requirements for storing and managing data and data privacy that a number of providers are struggling to catch up with. So it's great that there's this growing momentum around data, and what we found is that there is some really, really good work that's been done by some of the open data initiatives and folks like Mercy Corps in this program to make those opportunities transparent and to support some of those movements and those use cases. But there's a need for a common understanding and taxonomy. That is something that we've tried to take a first step on in this work, and the use cases for agri-data extend into all the areas that agri-tech has been working for a number of years now. Very quickly, when we looked at the barriers, what we found is they fall really naturally into 5 broad categories. So this provided a bit of a framework for thinking about what's stopping some of these data partnerships from occurring and this data sharing from happening. And so what you'll see when you look at the case study is a breakdown of those 5 different areas, which have a number of sub-barriers. All that's been codified against where we saw them show up most prominently by type of institution or the type of use case. And we really link that then back into some of the other tools that were generated. So very quickly on the three tools that I mentioned right at the start of the overview here. One of the first ones was just understanding data fundamentals. So our hypothesis is that until folks within this ecosystem can start to have the same perspective on things like what types of data are there, where does that data come from, what are the common data traits and characteristics, how can that be used, how can it be shared, how can those data partnerships be codified and facilitated. Until we have some of those fundamentals, those reference points of taxonomies and our understanding of how they link to different use cases and have different traits, it's really hard to have a seamless conversation because everyone is referring to different things and there's not a common language. So what we've tried to do in these 5 fundamental question areas is set up a starting point for that conversation and for that common language. So I encourage you, if you have time and you're working with data, to really dig in there to understand some of those fundamentals. I mentioned also that we did some work around what's a common process for establishing a data sharing partnership. And we came up with these 6 steps that you'll see on this slide here. We found through analysis of many of the data sharing partnerships that were in the AgriFin portfolio that there were some really common steps, sub-steps that need to happen in each of those stages, and some common barriers that showed up at that stage. So we've codified all that. We've almost provided a little bit of the start of a playbook for stepping through this process if you are interested in establishing a data sharing partnership. Finally, and then I'll hand over to Victoria to give you a little bit of a further insight into this tool. We developed this organizational readiness assessment framework. So this we built around 4 what we call domains, which each have subdomains, in order to provide a comprehensive way of an organization looking at how data ready they are. And that includes understanding their own data availability in terms of completeness, integrity, timeliness, etc. The data management framework that's in place within the organization, the processes that are there to support data sharing, and some of the capability and people aspects to making that happen. So this framework was set up as a backbone, I guess, for the assessment readiness tool. And I'll hand over to Victoria to give you a quick overview and insight into how that works.
Great, thank you so much, Matt. Those are great highlights. And as we said, this tool is available to download on our website, but also on the portal, the event portal, you can find the link there. Matt, can I ask you just to put it onto full screen presentation mode? Thank you. Great, so as Matt mentioned, we've got a number of tools as part of the data sharing learning brief. And this one, the data readiness tool, is very simple, really. It's built around a Google form, as you can see on the screen now. We've provided some instructions. It's very self-explanatory. And really the reason we developed the tool was to help organizations assess kind of how ready they are to begin using data to improve their work, or to partner with others, but importantly also to identify areas that need more attention. So as you can see on the first section, we just collect some initial data, such as, what's the use case you want to use data for? Is it something around a new product you're developing? Is it risk scoring? Is it public information sharing? And then secondly, what's the type of data that's being collected? So this could be transaction records, demographic data, satellite imagery, or credit history. On the next slide, you'll see the 4 domains that Matt ran through. So the assessment is organized around these 4 key domains, and this is based on experience that's shown these to be pivotal in determining whether institutions can engage with data effectively internally within their own organization, but also whether they're ready to maximize the impact of data sharing arrangements. So the first domain, data availability, this is really looking at the existence of necessary data points their reliability, and the ability to use them in a timely manner. The second is data management. So here we're looking into the storing and retrieving of information, how information that's critical to the institution can become transparent with good management. The third on process is really looking into the guidelines that are necessary to ensure that data is shared widely and processes are in place to produce the information that can be useful within the organization. And finally, people. So this is, as it says, this is looking into the expertise and the kind of appetite amongst the different departments. So whether that's leadership, data, IT teams, and the general staff to use data. On the next slide, this is just an example of one of the pages of the Google form, and you can see that you simply choose from 0 to 5 for each of the questions, where 0 refers to no implementation, and then 5 is full implementation. Great, so the output or the outcome on the next slide, excuse me, is you can see, if you focus on the box on the bottom left, the 4 domains there that we've been assessing throughout the tool. This is really useful because it quickly highlights the areas in red here that are areas that need attention. So for example, in this case, in this test case, we are saying that, for data availability, the organization is looking quite good, but on process, there's lots of work that needs to be done. On the next slide, you'll see which is the second part of the kind of outcome of the assessment. So here is the specific actions that an organization can take. So this lifts directly from, the areas which have scored as needing improvement. So for example, here, if you look under data management, you can see that one area that this organization would need to improve on is their procedures. So basically ensuring that the standard roles and responsibilities have been assigned within the organization. So we've developed the tool, and we're really excited for people to start using it. So if you are interested, please do contact us. You can send us an email. If somebody could type my email address into the chat box, that would be great. Just drop us an email. We're interested for people to test out this tool and see if modifications need to be made. Great, so that takes us to the end of the first section of our session, and I would now like to invite our panelists to take to the virtual stage. Switch on their cameras, please. And we will begin, hi everyone, we'll begin on the panel discussion. I'd like to say thanks to Matt for taking us through the learning brief, and hopefully there'll be some questions for you, Matt, during the Q&A as well. So before I ask all our panelists to introduce themselves today briefly, I'd like to just give a little background on the panel discussion before we get started. So the title of the session, Improving Data Sharing to Increase Digital Climate Smart Agriculture Adoption. We've heard about some of the current trends, the barriers when it comes to data sharing for different organizations. And we definitely want to discuss these with our panelists today, because they're all working on the ground, experiencing these firsthand, but also working to address specific challenges with their own innovation. During the panel, we also want to move the conversation forward to look at, let's think of specific use cases for data sharing when it comes to digital climate smart agriculture. Now, we might need a quick definition at this point. Digital climate smart agriculture leverages digital tools to help smallholder farmers increase productivity and resilience in the face of climate change, while contributing to mitigation where possible and appropriate. So what we want to do during the panel is cover what we're seeing as current trends, but also look forward at the specific use cases in the climate smart agriculture sector. And just to note at this point, we have a session on Thursday which is focused on climate. It's at midday East Africa time, and in that session we'll go into a lot more detail on the subject of digital climate smart agriculture, and my colleague John will be presenting our climate strategy for the next 4 years. So please do join that session. Great, welcome panelists. I would like to ask you all to introduce yourselves very briefly. Let's start with Georgia. Thanks, Georgia.
Hi, everyone. So thanks very much for inviting me to join the session. It looks like a really, really interesting session we've got today. So I'm CEO and co-founder of LearnInc. And LearnInc is an online tool to create fast and affordable training on a smartphone. You may know us originally as FarmInc. So if you want to digitize your training, you can simply upload your content into LearnInc and see it turned into a fun and conversational learning experience. So what does this have to do with data? Well, lots of people use LearnInc as a data collection tool, and you can track all of this data from survey answers to learning outcomes in real time on your LearnInc dashboard. And we work with organizations around the world, including many that are part of this conference, such as Digital Green. So happy to be joining the session today.
Thanks so much, Georgia. Inbal, over to you.
Great. Hi, everybody, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this great panel. My name is Inbal Bekler-Reshef. I'm the director of NASA Harvest. For those of you not familiar, NASA Harvest is NASA's program on food security and agriculture. It's relatively a new program we launched in 2017. And we're very much focused on the promotion and the adoption and increasing the adoption of the use of satellite information or Earth observations for use across really the agricultural sector in supporting decisions in support of food security, in support of resilience, in support of agricultural markets, and really working across the agricultural sector from the humanitarian side with governments and statistical organizations, humanitarian sector, and down into service providers for farmers. And so really trying to partner both with the private sector and government sector. We are implemented as a consortium of over 60 partners, really representative across the agricultural sector, with a large focus also on specifically on smallholders and a large area of focus on Africa specifically. And really focused, all of our activities, I would say, are driven by stakeholders and end users. And so we sit within NASA in the Applied Sciences program, and so very much focused on the transition from research into operations. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Inbal. Beza, over to you.
Hi everyone, thank you for the invitation for this channel. My name is Beza Bokale from Digital Green, based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Currently, I'm working as Director of Products for the Digital Agricultural Advisory Services project. My background is in information systems and design, mainly designing, developing, and implementing information systems. So the project that we are currently, Digital Green is currently implementing in Ethiopia, which is the DAS project, is funded by BMJF and FCTO, and mainly working in 3 objectives: to strengthen digital extension, and also identify various use cases to leverage data sharing, and developing a FarmStack application, which is a data sharing protocol to enable the data sharing across the different ecosystems. So we are currently in our 2nd year implementation project, and mainly trying to identify various use cases to leverage FarmStack. Thank you.
Thank you, Beza. And Boniface.
Thank you, Victoria, and everyone else. Boniface Akuku. I work for the Kenya Agricultural and Livestock Research Organization as the Director of ICT. We do research in agriculture in all areas: crops, livestock, cross-cutting areas. But in KALRO, over the last few years, we have embarked on digital transformation, basically generating a number of innovations using data, basically to address the pain points of the farmers. Back to you, Victoria.
Fantastic, thank you everyone. And just to note to the audience, if you would like to find out more information about the speakers and their organizations, you can go to the Marketplace tab where there's lots more info there. Great, let's get to the questions then. So I think I'll start with a question for Inbal and Boniface. We know that there's a lot of different use cases or ways that organizations are using data in the agriculture sector. But I think sometimes it stays quite high level and it can be quite difficult to understand what exactly we're talking about. So I think it'd be great if you could provide a few examples of the types of data that you need at KALRO and NASA Harvest, and what you have found to be the main barriers in accessing that data. So Inbal, could you start?
Sure, yeah, thank you. So while we work a lot with satellite data, in order to really translate that data into information and relate that to the ground, ground data is really critical. And so that's a core part, whether we're trying to map out where are the croplands, how have they changed and planting has changed from one year to the next, or if we're trying to map, where are maize versus beans versus wheat, for example. All of that requires us to have data from the ground that's geolocated, that says, okay, this is a maize crop, and that we can have the diversity of also what maize looks like, so we can then develop the models to map those and then have the data also to validate that. And so, we don't only want to create a map that looks great and has, every part of the country labeled. We really want to also understand, what is that accuracy of that map, if that's going to then help to drive decisions. And again, whether that's for farmer services or whether that's for government or for insurance purposes. And so that's a real big challenge for us to collect and to have access for. Of course, ground data collection is expensive, it's challenging. And there's a lot of folks that are collecting that type of data out there, and to some of, I think what we heard earlier is about building those relationships, so the trust relationships to enable data sharing where data has been collected. But also sometimes, the data that has been collected has not been collected for a purpose of using it with machine learning algorithms for satellite data. And so also making sure that it's GPS geolocated, for example. And so, a lot of times we'll get data sets and they would have been so rich if they were just also had, a GPS location with them that's at a high enough accuracy. Also, sometimes we do get data sets, and making sure that we can quality check and control those. And again, having some standards around the data and how we use them and the accuracy for those. But I would say that not only the challenge is not only the ground data. So while that's a real key point, so and the types of data is what crop type is, when was the crop planted, yield. Of course, if we're trying to develop models that can estimate yields or forecast yields as the season is progressing, so having any of those types of data. But I'd say another barrier and big challenges are also, there are a lot of groups that are producing maps or producing different information products, but also those are often, there isn't enough yet of a culture for sharing those products and sharing the code that's for those products. And so, in the end, what you've got is a lot of groups reinventing the wheel from the beginning, rather than being able to build on the code or on the products that have been developed and continue to improve and enhance on those. So I would say those are quite a lot of the barriers, and also the data sets that we're particularly interested in.
Thanks, Inbal. Yeah, that sounds very familiar to me. It seems there are so many organizations trying to crack this, but yeah, good to be having this discussion on data sharing today. So Boniface, from KALRO's perspective, what are the main types of data that you kind of need? I know there's a lot of work you're doing in the Data Hub, and what would you say are the sort of top 1 or 2 barriers you face?
Thank you. I think we need a lot of data sets, or we are already using a lot of data sets. The first one and the most primary important data is the farmer data. And this is not just the details of the farmer. We need to know the value chain, the variety, the specific location, the GPS coordinate of the farm, and the size of the farm, which is quite important. The other one is the soil data, because everything you grow goes to the soil. Therefore, it's important to understand the different soil parameters, soil pH, soil depth, soil texture. The other one is the remote sensing data, mostly coming from satellite, which basically is quite critical for us, what we call the Earth observation data. We also need market data, basically to inform farmers around marketing. We also need agricultural research data, which basically are good agricultural practices, pest and disease, agronomy, breeding, all types of data around research. And finally, we need climate stroke weather information data. Now, the most barrier to this accessing this data. I'll mention 3 top ones. Number 1 is the cost of collecting primary data. The cost of collecting primary data is a big barrier. As I mentioned, for example, the farmer data, we're not just looking at the bio data of the farmer, but we need the size of the farm, the GPS of the farm, the types of soil, the ecological environment. And again, even the cost of accessing remote sensing data is quite expensive. While the remote sensing data is free from NASA perspective, from European Copernicus, but to be able to make it analysis ready is quite costly, because you need skills, you need the resources, compute resources to make it. So there's a cost to that. So I think the second barrier is poor data democratization. Data is not democratized because of fears. There's a lot of data fears, data sharing fears. Most actors and data owners or data intermediaries have fears about making the data free or open. So there's poor data democratization, and also understanding the open data principle, such as the Creative Commons, has remained a challenge in the African context, where people tend to hoard data, people tend to not willing to share freely, people don't know the benefits of actually making the data open. And even through a license regime, they still don't understand that. I think lastly, I would say this lack of incentives to basically bring the value of data. So this poor data or data value proposition. So we have really not been able to have value of data, so that there's incentive to motivate people to share data or to make data valuable, make data open. And lastly, I would say agriculture is the least digitized sector in the world. And therefore, there's poor or low digitization of agricultural research data. CARAS generated a lot of data sets, but most of them are not digitized. And I think there's another barrier, because if they're not digitized, accessing them becomes a challenge. I think let me just mention those one, but there are other barriers. Thank you.
Boniface, thank you. And Imbal, really interesting to hear from your perspectives, obviously working at the level that you do at NASA Harvest and CalRO. I think turning now to Georgia and Beza, having heard these challenges that CalRO and NASA Harvest have experienced or continue to experience, as well as the other common shared barriers that we heard from Matt's presentation, everything from capacity to cultural barriers, commercial, regulatory, and reputational barriers. What's your organization? So what is Learn.Inc. and what is Digital Green doing to address some of the barriers or the roadblocks that organizations find related to data? So thanks, Georgia, if you could open.
Sure. So there's a huge amount I could talk about here. So maybe I'll just pick out one example for the sake of time. Imbal, you talked about the challenge of collecting ground data, which obviously we hear a lot. And Boniface, you talked about the cost of collecting primary data from the farms. So I'll give an example of where we've worked with an organization called Sixth Grain. They are using satellite data to track the field crop quality and so on. And what they need to do is collect ground data in order to ground truth those models. And they had designed an app to do this. So the app basically is downloaded to the phone. The farmer then goes out to the farm. They walk around the perimeter of the field, which then uses GPS to track the field boundary. And then the farmer inputs the data around what types of crops they're growing, when they planted, and so on. And one of the challenges they were having was, how do we get this app onto farmers' phones? And then how do we train them in how to do this? Because this isn't a simple process for someone who's never done something like this before. And that was costing them a huge amount of money. So I don't know whether they're happy for me to reveal the exact figure, but per set of ground truth data, it was getting extremely expensive to do this. So what we did was we worked with them to design essentially a kind of an onboarding experience for this whole process. So they use Learn.Inc. to create a training, a simple kind of interactive training that would explain why you would want to map your farm, how you would do that. We integrated videos of farmers doing it and talking about it. And then we had a really streamlined process that then onboarded that user onto their app, by which point they were really familiar with how to do it and the reason why that would be interesting for them. And then we rolled it out through online advertising. And so we were collecting farmers across Kenya to do this process. And it now costs them, I think, significantly less than $1 per farmer to collect that ground truth data. So that's just one example of where we've worked with people to do this. And I think there's a huge potential to use digital tools to really streamline the data collection process and kind of bring that data collection process into the 21st century.
Thanks, Georgia. And obviously data collection is the beginning for most organizations, whether it's private sector, public sector, whatever data you're collecting or whatever data you want to share needs to be collected first. So yeah, that's super interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Beza, I think when we spoke and you gave me the background on FarmStack, and we've obviously been working closely with Digital Green for many years at AgriFin. I know you had highlighted, the work you're doing on FarmStack is really kind of honing in on security and data protection. But yeah, maybe you can just tell us what else you're doing to kind of help the industry tackle some of these data sharing challenges.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. So Matt already explained the different data sharing barriers, and Mbale and Boniface explained the different data that they need for their implementation, and also Georgia explained how we can collect those data, right? So okay, what happens after the data are collected? We have to share them among different partners to be able to utilize them, right? So at the early stage of our implementation, the DAS project, we tried to talk to different partners in the ecosystem to really understand what kind of data they have and why they don't want to, if they want to share data to other organizations. So what we understood in that conversation is most partners have data. And in order to share that data, they want trust that they have a control over the data they are sharing. Also, they want to ensure the data that they are sharing is secure. So this is one of the challenges that partners share when in regard to aspect of data sharing. And at the end of the day, also once they share the data, they want to have value in return for the data that they have shared. So this is like Digital Green is can come up with the FarmStack protocol to mitigate this problem. So mainly FarmStack is a data sharing protocol. So when we say data sharing protocol, it will address the problem, or like the problem identified by partners in potential misuse of data. So so FarmStack, it's an open source protocol. It uses peer-to-peer connectors and usage policies for secure data transfer between organizations and also farmers. So definitely FarmStack tries to address the issue of trust by systematically implementing this data transfer. So maybe one example I can give is when we say trust, FarmStack will create a network of organizations where they can be able to link peer-to-peer, where they can be able to share data from one into another. And when we say security, different organizations will have different kinds of policies that they want to set, right? So for my data, I want the user to have this XYZ for the usage. So those things can be also set in the FarmStack protocol for them to be able to share the data among themselves. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Beza. There's so much you could share on all of this, I'm sure. That's really interesting on the customized security. That I didn't know that about FarmStack, but yeah, super interesting. Thank you. Before we move to taking some audience questions or coming through, I wanted to have one last question or two, if we have time, that are looking forward at within the kind of context of climate smart agriculture. So data sharing is obviously critical for most, if not all, climate smart agriculture solutions. So whether it's an early warning service for droughts or pests, or a bundle of services that includes input credit and insurance, for example, to try and get farmers to change their behavior and grow, let's say, a more suitable crop, or buy a more suitable seed for their region and their soil type. For all of these solutions, data is critical. So with the urgency of climate change in mind, what does your organization, and I'll ask each of you to respond, what do you plan to do to accelerate this data sharing in the agriculture sector? Obviously, what we've seen in the last year is a huge advancement in terms of conversations and lots more work happening on the data sharing side of things and big data products. But yeah, just interested to know from your individual perspectives what your organization's strategy is to accelerate this. So Inbal, if you could start.
Sure, great. So first and foremost, I would say that for us, data sharing and code sharing and product sharing is absolutely a top priority. And so I think we make every effort to make both the maps that we produce, the data that we produce, free and open, and not only that, but also working with whoever the stakeholder was really in developing and training and building that capacity, so that capability is transferred on. I think we try to set an example and show that when you do share data, the benefits that come from that, and I think Boniface alluded to this earlier as well, is kind of showing what the value is of sharing data and what are those mutually beneficial propositions from the different sides, and building on that. I think another piece of it, of course, is partnerships and forging partnerships. I think, you know, we've partnered with Calro, with extension agents, and recognizing, you know, who has the capacity to collect these kinds of data, who needs this kind of data, and also thinking about in the long term. I think we're less interested in coming in with a 2-year project, developing or demonstrating some capability and disappearing, but really thinking about the longer term. And of course, with different stakeholders with different data, that looks differently. But I think partnerships and building trust between these is absolutely key. I think the other area that we're very much focused on is developing and advancing methods and machine learning methods that can take in and utilize diverse data sets, heterogeneous data sets that are sparse, and trying to evolve the models that where we do have sparse data, and how do we develop models that are robust, that effectively use these kinds of data. Another area that we're very much focused on are developing strategies for collecting trainer data in more scalable ways. And an example of that is a project that Catherine Ekalembe, our Africa program lead, is leading right now. And so this is looking at, for example, a project that we're using GoPro cameras mounted on cars that can collect a lot of data very quickly, and then looking at how do we automate the images that we've collected from that, so that we can turn those into labeled data sets that we can use. Or we've got, looking more at citizen science efforts as well. I think, as Georgia was saying, a lot of the digital tools, a lot of people do have now phones that they can use, and how do we utilize these? How do we utilize people that are, I think we've seen a lot, especially under COVID, when movement was very challenging. How do we reach different networks that are already on the ground on these locations that we're trying to get access to data from, and build on that? And we have now a project, this happens to be in Argentina, but engaging with rural high schools, for example, and enabling them to collect some of the data that then supports the ministry there. And I think, of course, a big part of it too is, again, demonstrating the value of data, that and of the sharing of the data, and the sharing of the products and the partnerships itself. And I think that's absolutely key as well going forward, and being able to think, once you show and can demonstrate once, that's much easier for others to understand why they might want to share, what is the value in the type of data they have, or how can they collect that data.
Yeah.
So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Inbal. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing all that. We have 10 minutes left, so I'll ask the panelists to perhaps respond quite quickly so that we can ask answer some of the questions coming in from the audience. But just a quick reminder of the question. So it's really just, you know, what is your organization's strategy, or what are you doing specifically to accelerate data sharing, bearing in mind the urgency of climate change? So Georgia, what's Learning's approach?
Sure. So I think my answer would be that if we're going to accelerate the sharing of data, we need to massively accelerate the collecting of data. And I think that's the piece of the puzzle that we're really focusing on. So we're trying to help people, you know, create ways to collect data, you know, in minutes, not months, to be able to start collecting data tomorrow, and to have all of that data stored in a way that's really clean, on the cloud, sex disaggregated, best practice, and then to be able to see all of that data instantly displayed in real-time dashboards that they can then invite members of their team, that they can download to CSV. So we essentially create those tools to massively speed up that whole process. In terms of sharing the data itself, I mean, the data is the property of our customers. So we don't have the ability to share their data, but we definitely encourage the sharing of data. And actually we've seen, you know, a huge amount of that happening already. I mean, Beza, one of your colleagues at Digital Green is writing a paper at the moment about a project where they collected data using our platform. So absolutely, it's incredibly important, but I think the first stage, how do we accelerate the collecting of data, is going to be the key to this.
Yeah, agreed. Thanks, Georgia. So Beza, from your perspective, Digital Green and FarmStack?
So to accelerate like data sharing, we need to have we need to build trust among different organizations systematically. So that trust can be implemented, for example, through FarmStack, where a network of organizations can come together and define their usage policy for the different data sets they have, and based on this usage policies, for them to be able to share data among themselves, where they have control over what's going to happen on the data that they will be sharing. So this is one of the solutions that we can provide.
Great. And Boniface, Calro, what's your magic?
Yes,
magic
okay,
trick?
thank you. Yeah, I think for us, I mentioned three quick things. One is that we have developed a very robust roadmap and data strategy, which is guiding the steps. I think was done in conjunction with Massicop and Delbank, which is actually guiding the step how to implement the visions and the plans and the activities that we have around data. And that's going to encourage data sharing, because we've also listed the implementation framework, how that can be achieved within the strategy and the roadmap. The second thing is that we have established a big data platform, which is on high-performing computing. And this is having a good data infrastructure, I think is one way that's going to help us accelerate data sharing among different actors, policymakers, researchers, private sector organizations. So that's one plan or strategy that we are having. I think the last thing I want to say is that we are ensuring that there's data availability and data accessibility. And once we ensure the data availability and accessibility, this is going to stimulate innovation and usability and good development of data product and service or use cases, which again will also promote incentives and crowdsourcing practices, which can now allow data to be shared two-way from different users and different actors within the sector. And for us to address climate change, we basically have to use artificial intelligence, we have to use innovation, we have to basically use all sorts of means to get data through even as crowdsourcing as a technology. Back to you, Victoria.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So I'll just turn to the questions, some of the questions that have come in from the audience. I think one question coming in, what do the panelists see as the big opportunities for private sector service providers to work with open data initiatives to open up new data-led service possibilities? So what do we see as the big opportunities for private sector service providers to work with open data initiatives that will open up new data-led service possibilities? Hands up, anybody want to tackle that one? Go for it, Boniface.
I think it's a good question. I think the opportunity for the private sector is to develop innovations around data. And once they develop innovations around data, they definitely get a huge opportunities. We've seen that in Kenya, where those who have developed innovations in terms of use cases, in terms of product around data, they are actually having a lot of opportunities today. You look at globally, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, they just developed innovations around data. Uber, just innovations around data. So the biggest opportunity here is to come up with innovative use cases, product and services around data.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Boniface. There's another question coming, which I think is quite interesting. Maybe we can come back to the other one as well for one of the other panelists. 5 minutes to go. A question that I think, Inbal, might be interesting for you in light of the work you're doing in Kenya and Mexico. How can the great actors on the stage today collaborate to leverage data to attract banks to the sector through risk sharing? And how can we better engage the financial institutions? So how can the great actors on the stage today collaborate to leverage data to attract the banks to the sector through risk sharing? What do you think?
Thanks for that question. I think it actually relates back to the previous question and to what Boniface said. And I think, and that's about having, if you know you have public, good, reliable data sets that are there now and are going to be there into the future, that enables de-risking, whether that's for insurance or different loans and financial services or public sector. And so, for example, we have a project now with Swiss Re Foundation and the ministry in Kenya and of Agriculture and with CalRO. And part of that is understanding better the distribution of cropped lands, of maize, understanding better how can we then increase the efficiency and of sample frames and increase the efficiency of payouts, for example. But I think in general, if there was more of an understanding and a trust that these data sets are going to be there, and they're not just going to be there this year, but they're going to be there into the future, and you know that the accuracy, then one, you better understand what the risks are in terms of financial services, in terms of insurance, and then being able to rely on those types of public good products going into the future. And I think we've seen a lot of those examples. If you look at the US, for example, when there are these data sets that everybody knows USDA is going to put out on a crop type map every year, and a lot of services and financial instruments as well are developed based on those.
Mm-hmm. Great. Georgia, do you have any thoughts on that around attracting the financial institutions and engaging them through kind of, collecting and sharing better, as Inbal said, reliable data sets?
I would agree, and I would also pick up on what Boniface said around the role of the private sector in creating the tools to create this data. I think too often we've seen a kind of duplication of efforts where people are creating their own version of a data collection tool that's maybe not best practice. And I think this is the role of the private sector to bring really fast and affordable solutions to this that can work cross-sector. And that's what we're trying to do. So I honestly think this problem will be solved by the private sector. Hopefully it will be us. If not, then I think it will be solved within the next few years.
Great, good optimism. Great, I'm afraid we might have to call it a day on the questions. I would just quickly like to, as we have Boniface on the call, congratulate him on winning one of the AgriFin Awards around use of digital data to serve smallholder farmers. And he's CalRO, the team, Boniface and his team have been recognized for leveraging multiple streams of digital data to increase and enhance services for farmers. In the same category, we're also recognizing ATA in Ethiopia and eProd. So please look at the awards tab on the portal and you can find out all the information about everyone else who's won. I would like to, For the questions that we haven't had a chance to address from the audience, really sorry about that. We will spend some time on the event portal getting back to you on those. But thank you for being so engaged and sending through your thoughts and questions. And I think that is time. So I just want to say a very big thank you to Matt, Boniface, Georgia, Imbal, and Beza for all your fantastic insights and sharing everything that you're doing. Looking forward to carrying on the good work and keep talking with you as we go forward into our new program. So thanks everybody, and thanks to the audience. Have a great day.